I intentionally picked up the corruption in the banking sector, where huge banks were embezzled. Only one bank, which is Meshprom Bank, is $3 billion just taken out from the clients inside the country and moved out through 200 loans to offshore companies controlled by a New Zealand trust. Now the guy's in France. He bought a paper in France, François. Why would Sarkozy let him buy a paper? I mean, in every country they do protect. I was through this process. It's a highly complicated thing. You are being checked. With your sources of funds, I mean, whether there's any danger coming to the free media, how would Sarkozy would allow the guy to launder money for a newspaper, which has been closed, by the way?
Why does corruption happen? I mean, it's easy to think of it as being essentially because of the individual and factional venality of it. But it's more than that. It's actually a tool of state building. It's one of the classic ways in which you create, constitute, and bind to you national and local elites. And particularly in the context of Russia, it's been used through the 1990s and since in a process of effectively state rebuilding after the sort of anarchy that followed the collapse of the Soviet Union.
We see over the last 6 months a big agitation in the Russian society, a lot of mass protests, and mass protests are, of course, an important part of how the society can influence the authorities, but I think it's just the tip of the iceberg, and no less important are the tectonic processes that happen in the depth of Russian society.
And where we have seen successes, for example, in mayor elections in locations like Yaroslavl, it's precisely because the protest movement or figures within it were able to campaign not on big national issues, not on Russia without Putin, that has no real meaning to most Russians, but actually on grassroots political concerns. This is why the roads don't get built. This is why the schools and hospitals are crumbling, because of kickbacks, because of corruption, because we have an elite that just simply sloshes money around each other's pockets without concern for the ordinary Russians. It therefore is one of these potential rallying cries which can actually unite a political sort of movement against the current regime. Political movement which, after all, otherwise cuts across nationalists, communists, radicals, liberals, you name it.
Frankly speaking, I don't care my bank is being attacked. If they take away my license, it'll probably be an interesting trap, because I have Tier 1 30, which is the most reliable bank in the country. And the fact that they've threatened and frightened all of my clients, I don't mind. I have a more important stake in actually continuing the investigations in the banking sector, and I do count on support from the government. Well, I may be mistaken.
So from the Kremlin's point of view, it becomes a what do you do about it? And broadly speaking, there are kind of three, this is very, very much caricaturing in the interest of speed, three strategies. You can try and re-legitimate yourself, basically fix the problem. I'll be honest, I don't see the current regime suddenly having some kind of Damascene conversion and deciding that corruption is just so important that all of our old friends have to go and get locked up. If there was one tiny little window for re-legitimation, it was last year, and then when they decided that, just to inform the Russian public, by the way, Putin's coming back and we'd sorted this a long time ago, didn't we mention it? I think at that point that window closed pretty conclusively. The second approach is co-optation. Buy more people off, buy more elements of society off. Maybe once upon a time that would have been possible, but again, the money isn't there. If you are going to continue to pay off the elites who you currently are and try and find new people whom you can reconcile, that's going to take a lot of money. I mean, already Putin has basically pledged monies that, frankly, the Russian government can't afford. So it's hard to see that as a sustainable approach. The third one is, unfortunately, coercion. The third one is if you deal with protests by cracking down on them. And maybe you will then have an anti-corruption dimension to it. I wouldn't be surprised if we soon see a whole slew of new arrests and trials. However, it will probably be, conveniently enough, individuals who happen to be out of favour with the current regime. I mean, this is the great thing about a system in which corruption is so endemic. Most people will have skeletons in the closet. You just decide whose closets you're going to rummage through.
We realize that this regime will not go away by itself. So our strategy consists of two parts. One is creating points of stress for the system so that people and the business and the political elite, which is intertwined in Russia, is compelled to change, and we do it on several fronts. One is mass protests, another is investigating and making public the specific cases of corruption in the government. Another one is trying to organize this popular unrest in some sort of organization, possibly a party at some later stage. And another part of our strategy is providing people with a reasonable, good alternative so that they would have an answer to the question, if not Putin, then who?
Unfortunately, I believe the regime, on the one hand, cannot afford to give up on corruption, and at the second, cannot afford to allow the protest movement to continue to use the campaign against corruption as its rallying cry, is certainly in the short term, I think it's unfortunately presaging a fair amount of trouble, a fair amount of, repression in Russia. But, and this is said from the point of view of someone who lives a long, long way away and therefore doesn't have to worry about actually living through it, and there's always that discomfort. But nonetheless, in the long term, from this turmoil, I think very positive developments will take place for Russia.